Welcome back to Bridges Over Walls, the podcast where we explore the relational walls Christians create and what to do about them. I'm your host, Caleb Isley, and today we're going straight to the source of so many of our interpersonal issues. Today, we're talking about trauma. It's no secret that trauma, whether it's personal, cultural, or even religious, can dramatically shape how we see the world and how we interact with the other people in it. And for many Christians, religious spaces can be both a source of healing and a significant source of struggle. The people around us carry so many experiences and stories that we know nothing about, and it's easy to miss the ways we might unintentionally be hurting others. In this episode, we'll explore how trauma affects us physically, socially, and spiritually, and how each of us can grow in how we relate to other suffering people. Our guest today is Pastor Katelyn Weakley, who currently serves at 2 churches in the greater Portland, Oregon area. Katelyn carries both a master's in divinity and a master's in social work degree, and regularly speaks on the importance of trauma-informed ministry. Whether you're navigating personal struggles with the Christians in your life, or just hoping to better understand how to connect with others on a deeper level, this episode is for you. Welcome back to Bridges Over Walls.
When I was fresh out of college, I was teaching at an Adventist academy. I was teaching Bible class. I didn't have a pastorate on the horizon, but I knew that God had called me to ministry. I loved ministering for people, for God. I loved working with kids. And the struggle I had the most was I had kids who would come to me and say, "Hey, I'm cutting. I don't know how to stop. I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl. I'm struggling with all these different things." And with my undergrad in psychology and religion, I had a lot of theory, but not a whole lot of practical tools for helping with these very real life circumstances. And so when I left teaching, I knew that if God was calling me to ministry in any capacity, I wanted to get better equipped at working with people for God in a broken world. And so I went to seminary, got my master's of divinity, and at the same time also got my master's in social work. And as of a few months ago, I actually have a license in clinical social work as a pastor. I do a lot of counseling, I do a lot of community engagement, and honestly, a big part of that for me has been ministering to people who have experienced a lot of spiritual and religious abuse. When you have a congregation filled with broken people who need a therapist, but have been told or have a belief that therapy is wrong, who do they go to? They go to their pastor. If you're trained to be a pastor, you might have one class in pastoral counseling, and maybe you have a class that has to do with community engagement, maybe. And so you have a lot of caring, wonderful pastors who are placed in positions where they are not trained and equipped to most help, to most serve. I highly recommend, if you are in ministry and you're able to get even a little bit of that social work perspective, it's gold. The social work perspective just gives you a greater view on interconnecting with your community. Professors of mine have the classic line that, well, Jesus was, he was kind of a pastor, but really he was mostly a social worker. And I think that's kind of true, is the way that we engage with people. Yeah, it should be assumed that we are engaging with people in a way that is putting love above being right? That's putting kindness and compassion towards others above telling them what to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the time in ministry, we come from how can my church or how can I serve the community? When 9 times out of 10, the community is doing a better job at serving the community than we are. And so it's about connecting with those stakeholders, connecting with those movers and shakers already in the community, and being in partnership rather than being the Christian saviors we like to be. And having that background in social work has been tremendous in being able to meet people where they're at.
Yeah. One of the goals of this show is just kind of taking a second look at our Christian culture and some of the ways, kind of the norms that we've developed over time. You know, the things we miss and how we hurt people. As a person who, suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, coming into a church space it's almost like going into a different country almost. It's like this whole different set of rules. It's this whole different set of norms. And so one thing that I would love to ask you is just kind of this definition of trauma. Each person, when they hear that, they might think of something slightly different.
Yeah. Trauma is very encompassing. It's incredibly varied. In general, trauma is anything that you've experienced that is an actual threat or perceived as a threat that causes your stress response to go out of whack, meaning that your brain is not operating in that kind protective way anymore, but is operating in a way that sees danger wherever you are. That's where you're talking about re-triggering sights or sounds or experiences that you experienced when you had this initial time of heightened stress response that goes beyond the necessary moment. You see that again, that pulls you right back to that moment where you're fearing for your life, where even though you might cognitively know, I'm perfectly safe right now, your body doesn't know that. Your body is fighting for its life.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, the broken world we live in, that comes from a myriad of places. That comes from family members. That comes from religious settings. That comes from that one time at the zoo when I heard that the tiger was loose, right? Like it comes from all over the place, and especially is ingrained in us from a young age. There's certainly trauma has a severe effect later in life, but there is something even more impactful about the patterns that your brain makes when you are young, when you're a child, and you experience these hardships that affects you potentially for the rest of your life.
And there's a lot of different types of trauma, right? A car accident is going to be a different way of affecting you than, growing up in a place where you're just constantly shouted at.
But the interesting thing is that while you might have two different people who've experienced two different traumas, and we might say, oh, well, that fatal car accident, that was terrible. And this person experienced, maybe a house fire, but everyone was fine. Everything worked out great. But the way that this person experienced that house fire could be as severe as the person who was in that car accident. And so we have lots of different types of traumas, but they don't affect us all the same.
I know for myself, it's this inability to not be thrown back into fight or flight sometimes, where just certain situations or things that remind me of my own trauma, it's just kind of like your heart starts beating, you can tell that you can't think as clearly. And it's that feeling of being scared and like trapped, right? Like you have to get out.
You mentioned fight or flight. I'm going to add one more to that, freeze. Fight, flight, and freeze are those three most common responses. Fight, I'm ready to attack this problem head on, whatever is going on. I need to fight my way out of this. Flight, I got to get the heck out of here. I need to create some space between me and the stressor. And freeze, where I just panic. Like I am just stuck. I can't move. I can't breathe. I am stuck here until this moment passes. So with trauma, every person experiences it a little bit different, but the same mechanism roughly is happening in your brain, where your amygdala is saying, hey, there's danger. This is a problem. We're going to flood our brain with cortisol. We're going to get ourselves in a state of being to try to handle whatever this problem is, which, like you said, you can't think. Your brain is flooded with cortisol, and so you're just caught in this emotional state, not able to make good rational choices, just in this high emotionality until you're able to bring your brain, your heart, your body back to a state of rest. And so no matter what your what your trigger is, or no matter what your trauma is, that is kind of the commonality, is that stress response that shows up when the average citizen looking around would say, well, that shouldn't be showing up right now. This is not a time when your body should be reacting this way.
And I think when a lot of people think of trauma, they think of either abuse at home, accidents, military service. But there's another topic that I think maybe is closer to home for this show, and that's religious trauma. How would you define religious trauma?
Yeah, religious trauma, again, like most traumas, religious trauma is broad. It can show up in a variety of ways. And I'm sure that in our short conversation, there will be someone who's listening and saying, hey, but she didn't say, yes, it's true. I'm not going to say everything. But in general, when we talk about religious trauma, we're talking about two main concepts. One type of religious trauma that's prominent is using religion as a means of coercing, manipulating, controlling someone, intentionally or unintentionally. The second one, which is a little less common, but unfortunately way too common, is using religion as either a rationale for or in tandem with other forms of abuse, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. When we have a religion that is based upon a fear dogma, then you are breeding opportunity for people to have a poor perception of God, a poor perception of themselves, a poor perception of the world. That, I think, is one of the most broad forms of religious abuse that we find, religious trauma that we find in the church, is saying, hey, we're having some financial difficulty. I guess, we weren't living up to what God wanted us to, and so he's removed his blessings from us. That's not right. That's not true. We have a lot of these fear-based things. You've talked before about the classic Jonathan Edwards, is it? Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, right? Where, I need to follow God because actually God is a God of wrath, and if I don't follow him, then life is eternal torture and suffering. That is religious abuse. That is religious trauma. And while in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we're not preaching sinners in the hands of an angry God, some places around the world, we're not far from it. There's a lot of fear underlying our approach to theology. And that has real life implications and creates real life suffering for people who are just trying to follow God, who theoretically loves them, who they hear up here loves them, but who they know in their heart, there's no way, right? So there's a song that came out by the band We Three, a sibling trio out of McMinnville, Oregon. They were on, I think, America's Got Talent 2018 or something like that. They released an album, and on this album, there is a song entitled Hell as Well. Very powerful song, massive trigger warning if you've experienced any sort of sexual violence. But the first verse of the song has to do with clergy molestation of a child. Second verse has to do with the question of why women are not allowed to preach in church. And there's this undercurrent of how some of the singer's friends, because of their position, their attitude, their lifestyle, they're guaranteed to go to hell. And so the singer sings, well, then if that's what's right, then I guess I'm wrong, so I guess I'll go to hell as well. Very powerful song. As a pastor, very impactful for me. I'm listening to this song and I'm just like Googling a little bit. And I kid you not, the very first thing that comes up in my search is a Reddit forum from an ex-Adventist saying, this is my experience. I identify with this. The band is not from an Adventist background, as far as I know. But the fact that a song like this hits Instagram, hits Spotify, and has so many people commenting and resonating with it and saying, yes, this was my experience. Yes, this is why I left the church. And then for a top search result to be an ex-Adventist saying, yeah, this is why I left the church. We have a problem. We have a massive problem, and we have to, as a church, across the board, from leadership to members, we have to acknowledge that this is an epidemic, that this is a significant issue. It's not a them issue, it's an us issue that we have to wrestle with. We have to identify and say, how are we as a church damaging people? And be honest and authentic and critical in thinking that through. Because as long as we say, oh, those songs have to do with the Catholic Church because all of this, all the history of what they've got going on, as long as we keep pawning it off elsewhere, then the epidemic of trauma within our church is going to continue to grow exponentially.
This kind of is one of the big unspoken divides between people who are still actively participating in religious spaces and a lot of people who no longer can or no longer want to. You don't know how many people have suffered through this stuff. You don't know how many people that walking into a church building is the scariest, most anxiety-inducing reminder of the worst in their life. And yet, on the other side of it, there's a lot of people who have been through these things that just, that's all they've known sometimes.
This is church. This is normal.
Yeah. And so I think, there tends to be a lot of kind of not super informed debates about getting people back in church and, why people leave, because they just want to like go be sinful, or they want just no rules or whatever. When you're in church, you kind of hear things like that said by people. And I have to admit, every time that I hear something like that, my brain jumps right to all of the people who have suffered in churches. It jumps right to the people where the hymns were the soundtrack of their abuse. The pastor was the person that they're the most scared of because they were a scary, awful person to them.
Yeah.
It's like these ships passing where it's like almost two separate, circles of conversation where one side of this is just completely disregarding all of the suffering that's happened within Christian spaces. And then if you've been through that, sometimes it's hard to see anything else happening in churches when you know that it can be so awful.
I think for most people that I have interacted with within the church are people who might acknowledge, yes, there is spiritual trauma, there is spiritual abuse, but it's not happening here, right? I've heard stories about that. I've heard about that one church where that thing happened, right? But it's not happening here. It's really hard to be self-reflective. It's really hard to say, this might be happening within my own church community. And then you have people, like you said, you've got folks who say, no, this is a problem. And sometimes they leave. And the people who don't understand, the people who don't recognize that this is trauma that they are leaving from, it's either we are so sad to see them go, truly. We want to bring them back. How can we bring them back? Or it's that maybe they didn't fit in here anyway. Fortunately, I think we're more the first one. But even that one is coming from a space of doctrine over curiosity, of saying, well, I already know what's right. I already know the truth. And so they're probably leaving because they don't agree with the truth, or maybe they had a little snafu of something, but the problem's not the church, right? The problem's never the church. What I love is when people say, I have been hurt by the church, I'm going to walk away. And the church's response is, I'm sorry. The church's response is, okay, we're not going to see you in our worship service, but I'm still going to text you on your birthday. Like, I'm still going to give you a call and see how you're doing. I'm going to still take you out for coffee. That is the restorative way, I think, of engaging with someone who has said, enough is enough. I need to go. Because religious trauma is a terrible thing. And also, therapists will tell you that almost as traumatizing as religious trauma itself is leaving a religious space. Leaving that community is such a difficult and painful thing for someone to do. And trying to reframe, like, I grew up in the church. This was my home. These were my people. This was my culture. And now I need to figure out what my new home is. I need to figure out what I actually believe. That is upending your entire world. And so when we see someone leave in our church, we have rightfully so, we have such a push at getting people back. We have such a push for like, don't let them leave. How are we going to keep people in the church? And also, once they're gone, how can we bring them back? What if instead of that being our emphasis was not how many people we have in our church, but how can I love each person, whether they're here, whether they're not, whether they were here and they left, and say, I'm gonna walk beside you as you're finding your new normal.
And is it really a service to that person to try to bring them back sometimes? If coming into that building and being in that environment is re-traumatizing, if it's the thing that brings you back to those horrible moments in your life, if it's the thing that brings you, sleeplessness, pain, and you're just stuck in that, is it good for you to be back in that environment?
No.
Right? And I just feel like this is something that we just kind of blatantly ignore or we're unaware of, where it's not always good to bring somebody back to church. I think that it's good to have people who are part of the church, the body of believers who are involved in people's lives. But when we're limiting it to, are you showing up for a sermon? Are you showing up for a Bible study? Are you coming to the work bee or the cookout, right? I think that's kind of where that starts to happen, is when the priority is kind of butts in the seats, right? It's just like, but we want a bunch of people here, and that's our goal, rather than how am I serving each individual person in the way that causes them to flourish and heal.
And a lot of that, I think, comes from us believing that we know what's going to be the best for someone.
Yes.
I know that the most loving thing is for you to be here in our community of faith worshiping Jesus. What if that's not true? What if that's not the thing that they most need? What if that is not what love looks like most for them? There are a lot of norms within the church that we accept as bread and butter, that a critical examiner might look back and say, actually, this has been harming a myriad of people for a very long time. One that I love to bring up is toxic positivity. As Christians, we love to celebrate joy, as we should. We love to celebrate peace and contentment, as we should, because this is, Christ says to come to him to experience these things. And also Christ is the same one who is weeping, who is on his hands and knees in Gethsemane, sweating blood. Like, we have all of these experiences of the divine also not being joyful, also not being happy. If Jesus himself was not always positive, yippee-ki-yay, let's go. If Jesus himself was not always bright and sunshiny, I think we have the freedom to not always be bright and sunshiny too. That doesn't mean that we're called to wallow in our sorrows. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to be happy, but I think what it means is to be authentic, to allow ourselves to feel. And oftentimes with toxic positivity, what's actually happening is a person is identifying, here is a feeling, it is uncomfortable to me. I do not want to experience this anger. So I'm just gonna tuck it down. I'm not going to engage with it. God wants me to be happy, so I'm gonna choose to be happy. Let's be happy. You're not necessarily dealing with the root issue. You're putting a nice little Band-Aid on, and that's gonna look great for other people. It might feel good for you temporarily, but you're not addressing the core issue that's going on in your heart. Toxic positivity says, you don't need to address that. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That doesn't mean put on a smile and that's going to give you rest. It means come with what you're feeling. Be in the midst of your feeling. Experience it. And I think that's what the inverse of toxic positivity is.
Because I can imagine someone listening to this that hasn't considered it before. They're probably thinking, what's the harm of that? Why do I need to show that I'm sad? Isn't it just better if I'm just smiling? Isn't it just better if I'm like, if I lift the spirits of the people around me, if I'm shaking hands? How does this cause harm?
Great question. Toxic positivity can cause harm a couple of ways. One, it can be harmful for yourself. If you're not ultimately addressing stuff that you have within you, it's going to come up. You can only hold vomit down so long. It's going to make its way back up. But also, you are modeling for other people. You're modeling for the 6-year-old whose grandmother just died. You're modeling for the new convert who's coming in who is struggling with their addiction. You're showing them that Christianity means being happy all the time. Then they're going to start to wonder, well, maybe I'm not a Christian, or maybe I don't fit here, or maybe I don't fit with God because I'm not able to keep that up. I'm not able to be happy all the time. I can't be happy all the time. So maybe I don't belong here. So yes, there is a place for trying to lift people's spirits up and try to cheer them up. And also, we need to allow people to experience a myriad of emotions. They've been given to us for a reason. And being able to meet with people where they're at, in their sadness, in their worries, and their stresses, is going to be much more powerful and create a much greater place of belonging than saying, come in here and put a smile on.
This is taking me back to the last church I attended before I stopped going to church for several years. And I think that this is one of the problems that I was having is I got lots of handshakes. I got lots of happy Sabbaths, and I got lots of smiles, but I felt so alone. I felt so unseen, unknown. I was struggling really hard in life. And for all of those handshakes and smiles and kind of plastic greetings, no one was really taking the time to get to know me.
And how
you know?
isolating to experience that.
Yeah. And so it's like, well, what am I doing with these people? Like, why do I come back to this place? Like, I don't feel part of it, right? I don't feel like, how can you be part of something where the people there don't know you, right? And don't take the time to. And especially when you're going through harder times in life, you're showing up to a place where you're like, these are supposed to be the most helpful people in the world. These are supposed to be the most comforting people in the world. They serve that Jesus that I see in the Gospels. Mm-hmm. These are the people who are trying to represent him in the world. And so you go to that place and you're like, man, when am I going to see that? When am I going to see that character reflected in the people who claim this person, claim this God? And when you don't, it's such a confusing and just hard to wrestle with thing where you're like, well, what's the purpose of this place then?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can read my Bible at home. I can watch a sermon on YouTube. Like, what's the point of coming to this here building? And if I can't find God there, especially, it feels like a disservice to yourself to spend that time and energy pouring into this kind of empty black hole of a place. And so, yeah, I think it's easier to do than we realize. Even for me, I know I get caught up in so many different stresses of life and so many different things that sometimes I don't have half an hour to stop and talk with people. Yeah. But when it's like everyone around you is kind of all doing that, I think we're kind of missing the point of why we do church.
Sadness or anger or frustration or confusion, none of that demonstrates a faithlessness. What it demonstrates is you're human. And when we come to a space that says, hey, we got to be happy all the time, I've got the joy down in my heart, it creates a difficult space for someone to be human. And people like being able to be human. And so they're going to find somewhere where they can do that. And church is not necessarily where it's going to be. For me, my favorite thing in ministry, my favorite thing being a pastor is creating spaces for restoration. And that can happen in a church building. That can happen on a Wednesday night Zoom Bible study. And that can happen with a bunch of agnostics at a coffee shop, right? That happens with the people who are hanging out at the park on a Saturday morning, laughing at those who are meeting in the church building, right? So that, for me, that's what being a pastor is all about, is creating spaces for restoration. As a pastor, I believe the greatest restoration comes from Christ. And the greatest restoration from Christ doesn't necessarily happen in a church building, but it happens through loving people where they're at.
I think in my most cynical moments, sometimes I go back to the stories of Jesus and I imagine how Jesus would have talked to people if he talked to them like we do. And so it's like the demon-possessed man. It's like, here's a Bible study. We'll be back in 4 weeks. Get your stuff together,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But instead, I see Jesus really rolling up his sleeves, right? Mm-hmm. I see him really spending that time. The criticisms of him weren't just that he interacted with the sinful, the hated, the kind of bad reputation people of his society. It was also that he went further than that he ate with them. Yeah. That he touched them, that he spent time with them, that they were his friends, right? And I think even today there's a stigma around doing ministry like Jesus did, which is wild in a religion that's based on trying to be closer and closer to Jesus, right? But yet the second that you find out that somebody's ministering in a bar, the second that you find out that somebody's life is full of people who don't believe like them, who don't practice like them, suddenly they're kind of like viewed as like, there's like this skepticism, right? Like, oh man, they're probably on their way out of church, or they probably have this secret sinful life or whatever. But until we are doing those things, we're really not doing what Jesus did. On the day-to-day basis, he was downtown.
Yep.
On a day-to-day basis, he was in people's houses who didn't have a lot of money. He was in people's houses who had addiction problems and messy, horrible experiences in their lives. And yet today, I don't know that that's the norm.
And I think, to kind of come back to what we were mentioning earlier, I think a main reason for that is fear, once more. It's so much more comfortable for us to have distance. It's so much more comfortable to have distance. But if I am living a life out of fear that says, if I hang out with that person, well, it's a slippery slope, and then I'm going to Adventist hell, right?
Yeah.
But if we operate from a place that we are rooted and established in love, then it becomes a whole lot easier to actually go and engage with people. Evangelism then just looks like being friends.
Yeah.
And what a great concept, right? Because that's what we see Jesus doing. His evangelism was, hey, pass the bread, right? Like that's what we're called to do, called to be. But getting close to people is scary.
And I think there's a very specific fear in Christian circles. If you had to like distill it into one thing, it's like this fear of corruption.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, don't mess up my holiness,
Yep.
right? Like anything that will put me in danger of hell or not going to heaven, like those are the things we're scared of. And I really, really see this strongly intergenerationally in this moment in history. Maybe always, but this is the one I live in, right? I remember having several conversations with people where they're like, I asked my parents, like, why can't we do this? Or why don't we do this? Or why am I not allowed to do this? And they had no answer, right? There was nothing behind it. It was just like, well, we don't do that. And really the unspoken truth there a lot of times seems to be, I don't understand it and I'm afraid.
Yep.
It seems bad and I'm afraid. Just this week, we released a video of a dearly beloved staff member wearing this cool camp shirt and everything, and it's got a goat on it. Right?
Man.
Only response on that video is, why on earth are you wearing that shirt? Right? And so in my mind, I understand this is a symbol that somebody didn't understand the history behind. They got scared of it. They associated it with the devil. And now their opinion is you shouldn't do that.
Certainly. Yeah. Well, and you definitely don't want to have Chev or, goat cheese, goat milk or anything, because straight to hell. It's a fear of corruption. And it's a fear that if I learn more about how this may or may not be corruption, well, that's part of being corrupted, right? One of my more formative church experiences was when I was a child. My parents worked at Wizards of the Coast, which is known for making all sorts of various games. And as a little kid, out came Pokemon, right? Pokemon comes out. And so I take these little first edition, these first print cards that I got from my parents over to my second grade friends, and I'm passing them all out. And the next day, one of my best friends brings back a Squirtle card that I gave her, hands it back to me and says, I'm sorry, my mom says I can't have this because it's from the devil.
Yikes.
And as an 8-year-old...
like, actually, it's from my parents.
Yeah. Oh, which is so much worse, though, right? Like, wait, it's my mom? Yeah, so as, like, you talk about religious trauma, that's to take a line from Inside Out, that is a core memory of mine that was very formative in my experience with the church. And it came from a place based on fear and ignorance. And so, once again, I think... we're just going now, but Caleb, I think that one of the best things that we as Christians can do to live a more authentic faith is to be honest in reflecting in our own hearts and determining how much of my motivation is fear-based. And upon recognition of if that amount is above 0, then I need Jesus, because Jesus' love is going to cast that fear out. I need a change in my heart. There would be so much less brokenness within our church if that was a real examination that each one of us who claim to follow Christ was willing to do in our own hearts. One
of the quotes that I think has been really helpful for me is that the truth doesn't lose anything by being examined. Right? So it's, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to start asking, why do we do that? Do it this way. Why am I so scared of this? What am I afraid of? How much validity is there to the stories of things that happen to people that do this? I'm thinking back to Pokemon, because, we were born the same year. Yeah. And so
classic.
I had the same problem where it's like, where are these fears coming from? And a lot was just coming from televangelists that later they found out they either plagiarized or made up half of the things that they were saying. And that was almost never even addressed. I remember one book that I had that the guy, it was touted as kind of this expert on Pokemon and how kids would like fall into demonic possession and join cults and gangs and all of this stuff because of the show. And they went back and did some research on this guy, and he had plagiarized and made up so much of his work. And actually was in lawsuits for it. And yet this is the thing that people are like, this is the real truth, And so it damaged my, when I have authority figures telling me these things, and then it turns out something like this, there's no apology, there's no repair. I don't listen to them anymore, because I don't trust what they say.
Yeah.
They were wrong that time. Why would they be right about what the Bible says?
Yeah. Last May, a year ago May, I did an evangelistic series, this restoration series that God wants to restore us holistically, completely. And probably the most powerful night of it was a night where I focused on apology and called out and recognized, hey, our faith has a history of messing up and hurting people. And we can point to a lot of those instances, and there's even more instances that we can't point to, but we know they're there. And so I apologized on behalf of Christianity, on behalf of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And afterwards, that's when, not the other nights, but that was the night where I had the most people coming up to me with tears in their eyes saying, I've never heard a pastor, I've never heard a ministerial figure acknowledging the hurt that has been done by the church, let alone apologizing for it. And the tremendous amount of healing that simple acknowledgement and apology can hold is just, it's tremendous. And I think we need to do more of that.
I had just this imagination of a world where our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation collectively got together to do that. And I thought of all of my classmates and my siblings and my friends and my loved ones and the people here in this community that I live in. And I can't think of anything that would be more powerful for them than to hear that and to see it be real. Because you can't take back the past. None of us can. But just that lack of acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about repairing these relationships with people and rebuilding trust in the church and trust in religion and faith? Start there.
Yeah.
Start there. Just let people know that you recognize you were wrong.
Yeah.
You didn't even mention that before this, just hearing it myself. I think we need that so badly. And we unfortunately don't get a lot of opportunities to hear it from people who were personally involved in the spaces we were in. But what would the church look like, and what would our relationships intergenerationally look like if our elders could say they were sorry? And it's crazy how quickly the healing can start when somebody means it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How quickly. I'm thinking, so my stepdad does a lot of intergenerational ministry.
Love it.
Goes through the history, the traumas, the things that we've each lived through as we were coming of age. And it's so different from, our elders today on through, there are things we've never had to live through, right? And we're living through things that they never had to live through. But I remember him telling me a story one time. He was working with a church, and there's this elderly lady who was there. And if I remember right, she was one of the more difficult people throughout these meetings. And he had the chance to talk with her later. And she said, I want you to know I called all my kids to say I'm sorry. And he found out that for years and years and years, there were these broken relationships between this lady and her kids because of the way that she had used religion to treat them. And those relationships were able to start being repaired. and healing with the life that she has left, because she was able to recognize what she had done. She was able to say, I'm sorry for that, and I want to be different. She wasn't a changed completely person then, within one day to the other, but she took those steps to say, I want to do this, that I want to heal, that I don't want to cause further harm, and that ultimately I want to be close again. And I think if we took that to heart, man, Christianity would be in such a different place today than we see.
There is a trauma-informed theory it's like the 4 R's. In order to build a trauma-informed organization, you have to begin with realization. Our members, our leaders need to realize that this is a problem, that trauma exists in the world and in our church. To realize that it is there and it is impactful, it is significant. The next stage is recognition, of saying, I'm going to understand what signs of trauma look like. I'm going to recognize that when that person seems to just freeze up, that is potentially a sign of trauma. When that person gets really upset when I mention this one thing, perhaps that's a sign of trauma. Having recognition of where trauma can be showing up in our church. The third is response. I'm going to choose how we as an organization are going to respond to this epidemic. That's going to impact our policies. That's going to impact our practices, our procedures. It's going to all be taken into consideration so that we can create a space of safety that promotes healing, that promotes authenticity, that promotes a community where people are worshiping God as we are intended to. And then the last one is to resist re-traumatization. It's to acknowledge that, hey, we've had issues in the past, you've experienced a lot in the past, so what can I do to make sure that doesn't happen again? What can I do to mitigate your pain and your suffering? And so I think in the Adventist Church, I think that most of us are hovering at 0 to 1 of beginning to realize that this is an epidemic, that this is a problem in our church. And then the next step is, all right, let's move from there. But we got to start with that. We have to start with an acknowledgement that this is a problem, and it's a problem that I've been a part of. Taking that ownership is not always easy. It's a whole lot easier to say, oh yeah, that guy over there, that guy who is in the news for that one thing, yeah, he's the problem. But it's a culture that we create.
Yeah.
And if we are not saying anything contrary to an oppressive culture, then we are part of that oppressive culture. And so we have to own that.
And I think we also need to know that we belong to a community of people that's not encouraging, supporting, fostering, tolerating spaces that hurt us. Yeah. I think there's a call to every person who is involved in religious spaces still, where it's not enough to dislike abuse. It's not enough to say it's bad or wrong or whatever. We really have to be intentional and vocal about creating spaces that are resistant and not tolerant to behaviors like this, right? But I don't know that the average person really knows where to go with that information, right? So what are some steps that, average church member listening to this, want to be better, want to create a place that my kids want to come, want to be a place where I personally feel safe and the people around me feel safe? What can kind of the average person do to help create that space?
Yeah, what can I do to create a healthy, safe space in church that's not going to leave people with emotional scarring, right? There is something called the sanctuary model, which sounds delightfully Adventist, so it's going to be very palatable. The sanctuary model was developed by a woman named Sandra Bloom, but a core element to the sanctuary model of trauma-informed care is this principle of changing our attitude from, instead of encountering someone that we don't know what to do with, they seem to be acting inappropriately, seem to be inappropriate, they're just wrong. Oftentimes, we will ask either aloud or hopefully more often in our minds, what is wrong with you? that is our go-to. What is wrong with Katelyn, right? Sandra Bloom's sanctuary model says we need to make an intentional shift of saying, I'm not going to say what is wrong with you, but instead I'm going to say what happened to you. What is wrong with you is a posture of this is what is good and what is right and what I know. You are not attaining that, so defend yourself. Why are you not measuring up? What happened to you is a posture of curiosity, is a posture of help me to understand you. At a baseline, if we as church members, if we collectively as a church had an attitude of curiosity that said, hey, I want to understand you, even when that person is acting like a fool and seem completely ridiculous and seem so wrong, we need to take a check on ourselves because we're showing up that way for someone else. And say, okay, I'm not going to ask what's wrong with you. I'm going to say what happened to you or what's going on. Or even, how can I help you? And Sandra Bloom says the goal is to move from what's wrong with you to what happened to you to eventually, here's what's right with you, where we approach people who seem so different from us and say, here are things that I love about you. That is the goal for a Christian community, to be a place that says, yeah, we're all different. We might even think differently. We might believe slightly differently. Heaven forbid, in a church, we believe differently, right? We might have all of these differences. And also, let me tell you about all the things that we can celebrate with each other. Interesting thing about religion is that I like to say that religion is a hammer, because you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use a hammer to go on a murdering spree. It is a tool. And unfortunately, in the area of trauma, the area of abuse, it's a real great tool. And it's an even greater tool because it has a spiritual backing. The impact of spiritual trauma is so much greater in some respects because it has eternal consequences, as eternal ramifications. It's so much bigger than common variety abuse, right? But in the same way, religion has been shown time and time and time again to be a tremendous tool for resiliency for trauma, for recovery for trauma. But the key difference between it being a tool for evil or a tool for good is about the community and the space that they create. It comes down to you and me. It comes down to who we are choosing to be. Are we choosing to engage with people for the intention of connection, or are we engaging with people for the intention of correction, right? The community that we create makes the difference. And if we are willing to be, like I mentioned, if we're willing to be self-reflective, if we're willing to be a little self-critical with ourselves and to say, hey, here's some things that we're doing well, here's some things that we need to change, and let's change them, then we can start to see a community of faith where people aren't running from, but people are flocking to. And it might not always be in a church building, but they're coming.